So, with all that in mind, let's take a quick look at heart disease in America, and we'll see some truly bad science in action. Now, believe it or not, 100 years ago, most doctors did not even learn about heart disease in medical school. Why? Because as far as they knew, hardly anybody died from it. They literally weren't taught about it. If you track the official statistics in America, this is what we get. Really low rate of heart disease here, and then around 1920 we start getting this rise, and by 1950 it's considered an epidemic. It is now the #1 cause of death in America. Now, to a certain degree, this rise statistically is exaggerated because the EKG wasn't even invented until 1920, so we probably had people die of heart disease that were never diagnosed. Also, penicillin had come along. So fewer people are dying from infections. Well, we're all going to die, right? So if you don't die from an infection, you're more likely to die of anything else, including heart disease. But even considering that, we clearly had this rising problem. And what really set off alarm bells in the medical community is by World War II, they were seeing a lot more men in their 40s and 50s dying from heart disease. Now, I've been a comedian, I've also worked in the media, so I understand the difference between a national problem and a national crisis. A national problem means bad things are happening to you and me. A national crisis means a celebrity has been affected. And in 1953, a rather important celebrity had a heart attack, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now we do have a national crisis. We have this epidemic of heart disease, and nobody knows what's causing it. And then, as luck would have it, along came a scientist with the answer. This is Ansel Keys. He was a biochemist, and in the mid-1950s, he published a study in which he compared fat consumption with heart disease in a half-dozen countries. This is what he got. Well, there you have it. Look at that. The higher the fat consumption, the higher the rate of heart disease. Trend line is unmistakable. Case closed. Eating fat causes heart disease. Because of this study, Ansel Keys became known as the father of what we now call the lipid hypothesis. This is what we still believe today. Saturated fat raises cholesterol in your blood. That's the first half. The second half, the high cholesterol in your blood is what clogs your arteries and causes heart disease. Everybody's familiar with that, right? Now let's look at some of the bad science that brought it about. First off, was this an observational study or a clinical study?
Observational.
Thank you. Observational. So does that prove anything? No, of course not. This is the association that Keys found because it's the association that Ansel Keys was looking for. But within the same data that he used to create this, heart disease was also associated with sugar consumption. It was associated with owning a television, and it was associated with owning a car. Ansel Keys could have zeroed in on any one of those, especially sugar, but he chose saturated fat because he had already decided saturated fat was the problem. And to believe that, he had to ignore some contrary evidence. And BS here, by the way, stands for bad science. Some of the evidence he ignored. Large populations like the Eskimos and our own buffalo hunting tribes who lived on diets that consisted primarily of fatty meat. Yet these people virtually had no heart disease. In fact, the Indians didn't even start developing heart disease until they were forced onto reservations and they had to start living on sugar and starch. A couple decades before Ansel Keys, there was a doctor who traveled the world named Weston Price. He examined populations, their diets, the degree of health they had or did not have, and he came to exactly that conclusion. Most populations, you will not find any significant amount of heart disease, cancer, or diabetes until the point that they start consuming sugar and white flour. Keys also had to ignore this contrary evidence. We had this big rise in heart disease, right? Well, if animal fat is causing this big rise, Americans must have been consuming a lot more animal fat, right? So let's look at butter consumption during the same basic period. Seems to have been going down. Okay, maybe it wasn't the butter. How about lard? Look at that big drop in lard from 1940 to 1960, straight down. That is the same time heart disease was shooting up. In fact, during the period heart disease was going up, Americans were not consuming more animal fat. They were consuming more vegetable fat because chemical processing had come along and made vegetable fat a lot cheaper. There was also this bit of contrary evidence. If Dwight Eisenhower had heart disease and high cholesterol causes heart disease, Dwight Eisenhower must have had high cholesterol, right? I mean, I bet if somebody checked his medical records, we'd find out it was way up there around... That was his cholesterol when he had his first heart attack. Now, if high cholesterol causes heart disease, why would anybody with low cholesterol get heart disease? But they do. It happens all the time, which you'll see. Now, this is the real reason I think Ansel Keys is probably the ultimate bad scientist. Let's suppose you have fallen in love with your own theory, and if your theory is true, you should see an association like this. Now let's suppose you gather the data on diets and heart disease from not 6, but 22 countries. You plot the data, and it looks like that. What would you do? You would do exactly what Ansel Keys did. He just threw out the data he didn't like and published his results. He was so convinced his theory was correct, he simply forced the data to fit the theory. Now, his punishment for being a bad scientist was to end up on the cover of Time magazine as a national hero. He later ended up on the board of the American Heart Association, and at that point, after several years of disputing the lipid hypothesis, the American Heart Association adopted it and started telling us all we should cut back on saturated fat and cholesterol to avoid heart disease. Now, since this theory was getting traction, not surprisingly, there were several clinical studies to test the results. Clinical studies, the kind that matter, right? Let's look at a few results. In the 1950s, there was the prudent dietary trial. Our intervention group went on a low-fat diet, including mostly vegetable oils. Control group, of course, was on their normal diet. The result, why the low-fat diet group dropped their cholesterol by 30 points. Very good, but there was no difference in heart disease. In 1965, there was a dietary trial in Britain. The intervention group cut their animal fat intake to 3 ounces of meat, 1 egg, 2 ounces of skim milk per day. They also dropped their cholesterol, but there was no difference in heart disease. Also in Britain, in the same time, there was a secondary prevention trial. Now, this time, the subjects were all men who had already had a heart attack, some of whom wore skirts, apparently. And the idea here was to see if by changing the diet, can we prevent a second heart attack. So they put one group on a diet where they switched their fat intake to polyunsaturated corn oil. Second group switched to olive oil. The third group, the control group, continued eating a diet high in animal fat. The results years later, corn oil group, 52% were still alive. Olive oil, 57% still alive. Okay, olive oil's looking good. The group that continued eating animal fat, 75% were still alive. 1969, there was the Minnesota coronary trial. This time, the diet group, low-fat diet, very little saturated fat, extra vegetables. They had slightly more heart attacks than the group that did not change their diet. And finally, the big daddy of them all, and I say that because this was run by our own National Institutes of Health, 12,000 men involved, some still wearing skirts apparently. It lasted for years. It cost $115 million. The intervention group went on a low-fat diet, avoided red meat, cut back on cholesterol. They were also counseled to quit smoking. The results, the people who quit smoking had a lower rate of heart disease. It's one of the studies that made it clear smoking can cause heart disease. But when they compared smokers to smokers and non-smokers to non-smokers between those two groups, the low-fat diet group, once again, had slightly more heart attacks. Now, I could quote you more, but you get the idea, right? Can we say there are black swans all over the place at this point? This diet, this hypothesis was failing over and over in clinical research. This guy's absolutely full of black swans. By now you're probably wondering, okay, what could have possibly kept such an unscientific, discredited, and possibly even harmful idea alive? In the 1970s, there was a special Senate committee. It was headed by George McGovern. Their mission was to deal with malnutrition. Not surprisingly for a government committee, they decided they should expand their mission and create dietary guidelines for the entire country. So they brought in the experts, they had hearings, they produced the guidelines. This is what they ended up giving us. They recommended that we reduce our consumption of fat, switch from saturated fat to vegetable oils, cut back on cholesterol to the equivalent of 1 egg per day, and eat more carbohydrates, especially carbohydrates from grains. Later, of course, that became the basis for the USDA food pyramid. USDA loved this report because it was telling people to eat more grains. Well, the USDA's mission is to sell grains. So if this is what the McGovern Committee recommended, it must have been what all the scientists told them, right? Of course not. There were several eminent scientists who testified to the McGovern Committee that there was no scientific basis for what they were recommending. Prominent British researcher named John Yudkin said if anything in the diet is causing heart disease, it is sugar. Another researcher named Peter Klee pointed out that heart disease, cancer, and diabetes are what we call diseases of civilization and said it is, quote, ludicrous to blame modern diseases on ancient foods. Saturated fat is an ancient food. He said if we were going to be looking at diet, we should once again be looking at the modern foods, such as sugar and white flour. The American Medical Association disagreed with the McGovern Committee, saying the evidence set forth in this report is not conclusive and there's potential for harmful effects from a radical long-term dietary change. And finally, the head of the National Academy of Sciences said, what right has the federal government to propose that the American people conduct a vast nutritional experiment with themselves as subjects on the strength of so very little evidence? There really wasn't much. But McGovern believed in the lipid hypothesis, largely because his own doctor had told him it was true. And this is how he handled dissent.
The committee's original report urged Americans to reduce their risk of heart attacks by reducing their intake of cholesterol down to the equivalent of about 1 egg a day. But doctors took issue with that at the hearing, saying that 8 studies involving 5,000 patients failed to show hard medical evidence that diet has anything to do with heart attacks.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist has of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
So the heart-healthy benefits of a low-fat diet became national policy because senators don't have time to wait for all the evidence to come in. According to people who worked with the committee, their thinking went something like this. Well, maybe we can't prove yet that saturated fat causes heart disease, but we think it probably does. So, we go ahead and start recommending that now. Why, we might save a whole lot more lives than if we wait 10 or 15 years for proof to come in to confirm what we think we already know. And if it turns out we're wrong, what's the harm? Well, I think there was a great deal of harm down the road, as you'll see later, but there was an immediate harm, and that immediate harm was to science. Because if you are a researcher, your research grants are your paycheck. No research grant means you're not working, you're not employed. And at this point in history, the U.S. government now officially supports the lipid hypothesis. The American Heart Association officially supports the lipid hypothesis. Those 2 organizations between them control more than 90% of all the funding dollars for research into heart disease. So what happens now if you're a scientist, not a scientist, you happen not to agree with the lipid hypothesis? A researcher named Dr. George Mann, who called the lipid hypothesis the greatest scientific scam of this century, wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine at this time, to be a dissenter is to be unfunded. Science writer Gary Taubes later wrote about this point, nutritionists knew if their research failed to support the government position on a particular subject, the funding would go instead to someone whose research did. And I want to give you an example of what he was talking about. During the making of my documentary, I interviewed this man on the phone, Dr. Kilmer McCulley, who back in the day was a researcher at Harvard, and around this time he wrote a paper saying something other than cholesterol had to be causing the rise in heart disease. Basically, he was saying that Harvard, which was getting a lot of its research from the federal government, was wrong, and that the federal government was wrong. To thank him for having scientific integrity, Harvard revoked his research grants, denied him tenure, and forced him to quit. And despite having a long pedigree from Harvard, it took him 2 more years to find another research job because, as he found out later, Harvard had blacklisted him. This is what happened to the scientists who disagreed. But if anything really drove it home to the rest of us, to the public, that we had to avoid saturated fat and heart disease to protect our hearts, it was this. Anybody my age or older, do you remember this cover? Remember that? The bad news.